The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and Robert Sutton had not even finished reading it before he set it down on the worn wooden table of his rented room in Denver, Colorado, and asked the landlady which road led south toward the New Mexico territory. Mrs. Polly Hatch, who had been sweeping the hallway outside his door when he called out to her, poked her gray head through the frame and regarded him with the particular squint she reserved for men who had lost their reason. She had rented rooms to cowboys, miners, and circuit preachers for 22 years, and she knew the look of a man who had just received news that scrambled his good sense. Robert Sutton, 28 years old and broad-shouldered with sun-dark skin and honest brown eyes, was sitting with a half-read letter in his hand and the expression of a man who had found something unexpectedly valuable and was afraid to look too closely in case he was wrong about its worth. "The road south," Mrs. Hatch repeated. "You have not even packed a bag." "I know it," Robert said. "I am asking before I finish reading so I do not talk myself out of going." She stared at him another moment, then told him the road, and he thanked her, and then he did finish the letter, because a man ought to know what he is riding toward. The letter had come from a cattle agent named Beaumont Harding down in Las Cruces, New Mexico, who had written to Robert on behalf of a ranching family called the Fairchilds. The Fairchild spread sat about 40 miles east of Las Cruces on land that bordered the Rio Grande Valley, and it had been worked by the family for going on 15 years. The patriarch, Gerald Fairchild, had died the previous autumn of a fever that went through the valley like a hard wind, and he had left behind a ranch, a small herd of longhorns, 200 acres of pasture and scrub, and a daughter. The daughter's name was Edna. The letter explained, in Harding's careful commercial language, that the ranch needed a foreman with genuine range experience, someone who could take on a share of the operational responsibilities in exchange for wages and a percentage of the annual cattle proceeds. The position was practical and straightforward. It was the paragraph at the bottom of the second page that had caused Robert to set the letter down and ask for directions before he finished reading. Harding had written, in what appeared to be an honest attempt at full disclosure that may or may not have been intended as a warning. "I must inform you in advance that Miss Fairchild, who at present manages the daily affairs of the ranch herself, and has done so since her father's illness last summer, is a young woman of very decided opinions. She has been described in every letter of reference I have sent to prospective foremen as proud and unmanageable. 2 men have ridden out already upon meeting her, and one wired me from Albuquerque to say he would sooner work a Colorado mine. I relay this not to discourage you, Mr. Sutton, but because you have been recommended to me as a fair-minded man, and I believe fair-minded men deserve fair warning." Robert had read those words proud and unmanageable, and something in his chest had shifted in a way he could not entirely explain, the way a compass needle shifts when it finds true north, not because he wanted a fight, and not because he thought himself capable of managing anything or anyone who did not wish to be managed. He had read those words and felt, in some instinctive place beneath his ribs, that they described someone worth knowing. Someone who had been left alone to hold a piece of land together after loss, and who had done it on her own terms, and who had not bent herself into a more agreeable shape just because the world found her inconvenient. He had set the letter down, asked for directions, and then finished reading, and by Friday morning he had settled his account with Mrs. Hatch, loaded his horse, a steady roan mare named Clara, and ridden south. The journey took him 9 days, which was reasonable time for the distance and the condition of the roads in the spring of 1882, when the ruts were still wet from the seasonal rains, and the passes through the mountains required patience. He followed the main road south through Pueblo, then angled southwest through Raton Pass and into the New Mexico territory, where the land opened into something wide and ochre and magnificent, the kind of landscape that makes a man feel simultaneously large with possibility and very small against the sky. The Rio Grande ran through the valley in a silver thread visible for miles, and the Organ Mountains stood to the east like a row of cathedral spires that had been built by someone with a grander imagination than any architect Robert had ever seen. He found Beaumont Harding's office on the main street of Las Cruces without much trouble. Harding was a short, energetic man of 50 with mutton-chop whiskers and the rapid speech of someone accustomed to transacting business before the other party changed their mind. He shook Robert's hand 3 times in quick succession, offered coffee, and then sat down across the desk and studied the younger man with the evaluative eye of a livestock buyer. "You are younger than I expected," Harding said. "I am 28, Robert said. "The last 2 men I sent out there were older. Both left." "I read your letter," Robert said. "Then you know what you are walking into." "I know what you described," Robert said. "I prefer to form my own opinions." Harding looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup, and his expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but contained a similar warmth. "All right," he said. "All right, Mr. Sutton. Let me tell you what else I know about Edna Fairchild, which I did not put in the letter because it would not have fit neatly into the commercial correspondence." He leaned forward and folded his hands on the desk and told Robert that Edna Fairchild was 24 years old, that she had been born on that ranch and had learned to ride before she could reliably walk, and that she had spent 10 years working alongside her father without complaint, and with more competence than most men Harding had ever hired. That when Gerald Fairchild had taken ill and begun to fail, it had been Edna who kept the herd from drifting, who negotiated the water rights dispute with the neighboring Alcott Ranch, who had ridden alone into Las Cruces in January to settle her father's account at the bank and argue successfully against the foreclosure notice that had been filed by a creditor operating on incorrect information. She did all that herself, Robert said. "With no help from anyone who stayed longer than a week," Harding said. He paused and looked out the window at the dusty street. "The thing about Edna Fairchild, Mr. Sutton, is that she is not difficult because she enjoys being difficult. She is the way she is because no one has ever given her a good reason to be any other way. Every man who has come to that ranch has come with the idea that she is a problem to be solved, or a girl to be managed, or a situation to be corrected. She recognized it in all of them before they had unsaddled their horses, and she sent them off accordingly." He paused again. "I am not telling you how to conduct yourself. I am only telling you the landscape, since you are riding into it." Robert thanked him, finished his coffee, and asked for the road to the Fairchild Ranch. He found it in the late afternoon, when the sun was low enough to lay long gold shadows across the ground and turn the dust on the road into something that looked like it had been spun from copper. The ranch house was a long adobe structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front, well-maintained but plainly worn, the kind of building that had been repaired many times with careful hands and modest means. There was a barn to the north of the house, a corral containing 4 horses, a water trough, and a vegetable garden along the south wall of the house that was already showing green despite the early season. He had barely dismounted when the front door of the house opened, and a woman came out onto the porch. He had not known what he was expecting. He had read the word proud and formed some vague image in his mind, but the image had not prepared him for Edna Fairchild in person. She was of medium height and lean in the way that people become lean when they work hard outdoors, with dark hair pinned up in a practical coil and dark eyes that assessed him from the porch steps with the frank directness of someone who had learned not to waste time on politeness that was not genuine. She was wearing a cotton work dress and leather boots, and a canvas apron with a streak of dark soil across it that suggested she had been in the garden when she heard him approach. She was, in a word, striking not in the soft, decorated way of parlor portraits, but in the way of something real and present and entirely itself. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You are from Harding," she said. It was not a question. "Robert Sutton," he said. "Yes, ma'am. You read the letter." "I did. Then you know what the last 2 men thought of this arrangement." "I know they left," Robert said. "I do not know what they thought because I have never met them." Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, a fractional alteration around her eyes, but he caught it. "You rode down from Denver," she said. 9 days, he said. "Clara here is ready for the corral and some water, if that is agreeable." Edna Fairchild looked at the roan mare with the frank, appraising eye she might have turned on any piece of livestock, and then she looked back at Robert, and something in her posture shifted by a very small degree, as though she had reset herself to a slightly different angle. "The corral is open," she said. "There is a pump around the south side. When you have settled your horse, come inside. Supper is in an hour." It was not a warm welcome. It was not an unwarm one either. It was simply a practical statement of available resources and the schedule of the household, delivered by a woman who had been managing without help for long enough that she had stopped performing hospitality she did not feel. Robert found he appreciated the honesty of it more than he would have appreciated a polished greeting. He led Clara to the corral, unsaddled her, pumped her water, and looked out over the land in the long amber light while the mare drank. The pasture to the east needed work. The fencing along the northern line was sagging in 2 places, and the grass near the creek had been overgrazed and wanted rotating. But the land itself was good. The soil along the creek bank was rich and dark, and the pasture had strong native grass that would come back with management, and the mountains to the east threw long shadows that would give the herd shade in the afternoon heat of summer. It was a ranch that wanted attention, not charity. He liked it immediately, in the way he liked things that were honest about their condition. Supper was beans and cornbread and coffee, served at a plain table in the kitchen, and Edna Fairchild sat across from him and did not make small talk. Instead, she asked him direct questions about his experience, and he answered them directly, and she listened with the focused attention of someone who was actually evaluating the answers rather than waiting for her turn to speak. He had worked cattle in Texas and in the Indian Territory and had spent 2 years on the Cherokee Strip before moving north to Colorado. He knew range management, water sourcing, and the particular challenges of desert grazing, which was more immediately relevant to her situation than anything he had done in Texas. She refilled his coffee without being asked and did not comment on it. "The north fence line needs work," he said. She looked up. "I know it. I have been planning to address it when I have someone to hold the wire. I can start on it tomorrow if you tell me where you keep the tools." "The barn," she said. "There is a full set of tools in the northeast corner. My father kept them organized." She paused on the word father only briefly, but he heard it. "The fencing wire is in the back corner on the right." "I will need to know where the herd is running," he said. "I can show you in the morning," she said. "I ride out at sunrise." He nodded. She nodded. They finished the meal. He slept in the bunkroom off the barn, which was clean and adequately furnished, and he lay awake for a while listening to the quiet of the desert night and the occasional movement of the horses in the corral. And he thought about the way Edna Fairchild's voice had paused on the word father, and how she had not apologized for the pause or filled it with unnecessary words. And he thought this was a woman who carried her grief the way she carried everything else, straight-backed and without complaint, and entirely her own. The next 3 weeks were the most quietly instructive of Robert Sutton's adult life. He rose with Edna each morning and rode the range with her at first light, and she knew that land the way a musician knows a piece of music, every measure of it, every difficulty and every grace. She showed him where the herd grazed and where they drifted in the heat, and which water sources ran dry by July and which held through August. She told him about the water rights agreement with the Alcott Ranch to the north, which she had negotiated herself that January by reading the original land survey documents her father had kept in a tin box under the floorboards, and discovering that the boundary line the Alcott family claimed was off by 30 feet. 30 feet, he said, when she told him. It was enough, she said. The creek bends there. 30 feet puts the bend on Alcott land if you use their line and on ours if you use the survey. The creek water matters in July. "What did Alcott say when you showed him?" "He was not happy," she said. "But he is an honest man, and when I laid the survey on his table and showed him the measurement, he sat with it for a long time, and then he said that his grandfather had probably made an error and that he would honor the original line." Robert looked at her in the early morning light, which was doing something remarkable to the dust that rose behind their horses' hooves, turning it gold and rose, and he thought that most men he knew would not have known to look under the floorboards for the original survey. "You saved this ranch," he said. She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite surprise but was in the neighborhood of it, as though she had not been expecting that particular observation from that particular direction. "It was my father's ranch," she said. "It is yours now," he said, "and you saved it." She looked forward again, toward the mountains, and did not say anything for a while, and then she said, "It was the water. Without the creek water the herd would not have made it through last summer." He nodded, and he did not press her, because he understood that she was not someone who needed to be told she had done well. She knew whether she had done well, and she trusted her own assessment over anyone else's, but that she might, on occasion, benefit from having it acknowledged by someone who understood what the accomplishment had cost. The fencing took 4 days. He worked and she worked beside him, because she was not a woman who stood and supervised while someone else did the labor she had been managing alone. And on the 3rd day of fencing, when they were working the far north corner and the sun was high and direct and the work was hard, she handed him the canteen without being asked and said, "You are not what I expected." He drank and handed it back. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would tell me to go inside," she said. "Or who would do the work differently just to be different about it." "Your way of doing it is correct," he said. She looked at the fence line they had built together, straight and tight and properly tensioned, and then she looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and he felt the full weight of her attention the way you feel the sun when the clouds move off it. "My father taught me," she said. "He said if you are going to do a thing, learn it properly, because a badly built fence is worse than no fence at all. It gives you false confidence." "He was right," Robert said. "He was usually right," she said, and there was the grief again, moving beneath the surface of her voice like water beneath ice, present and contained. He wanted very much to say something that would ease it, but he did not know the right words and suspected she would not want easy words anyway. So he simply nodded and picked up the next post, and she steadied it for him, and they went on with the work. The trouble with the neighboring ranch had been simmering since before Robert's arrival, and it came to a head in the 3rd week of May. The Alcott Ranch was to the north, and James Alcott, who was a reasonable man, as Edna had said, had an older brother named Carl who had spent the winter in Santa Fe and returned in April with a speculator named Vernon Prout in tow. Prout was a slick-dressed, narrow-eyed man from back east who had come west to acquire land and had acquired the habit, common among such men, of finding the most vulnerable landholdings in any given area and applying financial pressure to them. He had arrived in the Mesilla Valley with money and letters of introduction and had identified the Fairchild Ranch as a promising prospect. A young woman alone, the estate not yet fully settled, creditors who might be persuaded to call in old notes. The first indication of trouble came when Edna received a letter from the Santa Fe Land and Development Company, which she brought to Robert at the supper table one evening, with an expression that was controlled and cold in the way that hot things become when they have been through a very sudden chill. She set the letter on the table between them and waited while he read it. It was a formal notice of interest in purchasing the Fairchild property, citing a debt owed to a Mr. Gerald Fairchild's estate that had apparently been assumed by the company at some point during the preceding winter. The debt was for the sum of $340, and the letter suggested that if the estate could not resolve the debt within 60 days, the company would be within its rights to pursue legal action that might result in the forced sale of assets. Robert read it twice. "Is this debt real?" he said. "I do not know," Edna said. "My father kept his accounts carefully, and I have been through all of them. I do not find a debt of this amount in his ledgers. Who is the original creditor they claim to have acquired it from? A merchant in El Paso named Delaney, she said. My father bought feed on account from him 3 years ago, but the balance was settled. I have the receipt. You have the receipt, Robert said. I have the receipt, she said. He looked at her across the table and felt something settle and firm in his chest, the way a foundation settles when it is properly laid. Then we write to Harding, he said, and we take the receipt to the county clerk in Las Cruces and have it recorded, and we write to Mr. Delaney in El Paso to request a statement confirming the account was settled. Edna was quiet for a moment, and he understood that she was processing the particular sensation of having someone say "we" in the context of her ranch's problems. He wondered how long it had been since anyone had used that word in her presence and meant it as a shared thing rather than a courtesy. I can do those things myself, she said. I have been handling the legal correspondence since the fall. I know you can, he said. I am not suggesting you cannot. I am suggesting I can write a very clear letter, and that 2 people being aware of the situation is better than 1. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, all right. They wrote 3 letters that evening at the kitchen table, by lamplight, while the coyotes sang their distant, dissonant songs in the hills to the east. Edna wrote to Harding with the details of the claim. Robert wrote to the county clerk requesting information about the company's legal standing in the territory. They would wait for Delaney's address from Harding before writing to El Paso. He was finishing the last letter when he looked up and found her watching him write, and she looked away quickly, but not before he saw the expression on her face, which was something complicated and quiet, and which he turned over in his mind afterward for a long time before he went to sleep. Carl Alcott and Vernon Prout came to the ranch in person the following week. They rode up on a Thursday morning, while Robert and Edna were in the corral, working with a young sorrel gelding that had been poorly halter-trained and was still wary of hands near his face. Edna had been working the gelding with patient consistency for 2 weeks, and on Thursday morning she was making real progress. The horse was standing quietly while she moved her hand slowly toward his ear, when the sound of approaching riders made him throw his head and pull back to the end of the lead rope. She held the rope and talked the horse down with a steady murmur, and then handed the lead to Robert without taking her eyes off the approaching riders, and walked to the corral fence with an ease and deliberateness that communicated, without any drama, that she was not intimidated. Carl Alcott was a heavier man than his brother James, with a tendency toward bluster that expressed itself in a loud voice and a wide stance. Prout was the opposite, slight and watchful and precise, dressed too well for the dust of the valley, with the particular kind of stillness that suggests a man is always calculating. They dismounted at the fence. Miss Fairchild, Carl said, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed a conversation and is confident in his position, we thought we would ride over and discuss the situation with that letter you received. Which letter? Edna said. The one from the land company. I received correspondence from a company making an irregular claim against an already settled debt, Edna said. I am in the process of resolving the matter through the county clerk and the original creditor. Prout smiled. It was not a warm smile. Miss Fairchild, the debt was properly purchased and the documentation is in order. I understand the ranch is very dear to you, and the company is prepared to offer a generous purchase price that would allow you to settle comfortably, and I am not interested in settling, Edna said. I am not interested in comfortable offers from companies that manufacture claims against settled accounts. If your documentation is in order, it will withstand the county clerk's review. If it does not, you will remove yourself from my property and cease sending letters. Robert had been standing by the corral fence with the gelding's lead rope in his hand, and he had not said anything because Edna Fairchild was not the kind of woman who required her battles to be fought for her, and he was not the kind of man who would attempt it. But he held the rope and stood where he was, and his presence was a statement of its own, which was simply that she was not alone. Prout's calculating gaze moved to Robert. And you are? Robert Sutton, Robert said. Foreman. Prout reassessed the situation with the smooth speed of a man recalibrating odds. He looked at Carl Alcott, and something passed between them in the silent language of men whose plans have encountered unexpected resistance. "We will see what the clerk has to say," Prout said, and his voice was still level, but the edges of it had sharpened. "I expect you will," Edna said. They rode off, and the valley was quiet again, and the sorrel gelding blew a long, nervous breath through his nose and pressed his forehead against Robert's shoulder, which was something horses do when they need steadying, and Robert put his hand against the horse's neck and talked him down, and Edna watched from the fence, and her expression had the particular quality of someone who has just been through something that required more from them than they intend to admit. "They will come back," she said. "Probably," Robert said, "but they will come back to a smaller position than they started with, if the clerk confirms what you already know about that account." She was quiet. Then she said, "Thank you for not speaking over me." He looked at her. "Why would I do that?" She looked back at him steadily, and her eyes were very dark in the morning light, and what he saw in them was something that might have been, under a different name, longing not for help or rescue, but for the thing she was experiencing right now, which was the simple and apparently rare presence of a person who did not feel compelled to stand between her and her own life. "Most men do," she said. "I am not most men," he said. She nodded once slowly, and then she said, "I know it," and turned back toward the house to begin the morning work. He stood with the gelding for another long moment, feeling the spring sun on the back of his neck and the subtle, persistent pull in his chest that had been growing since the first morning. He had ridden her land with her and watched her call the creeks and the pastures by name, and he acknowledged to himself, quietly, that he was falling in love with Edna Fairchild, and had been for approximately 2.5 weeks. The response from the county clerk came in the second week of June. It confirmed what Edna had known. The debt to Delaney in El Paso had been settled in full in 1879, and the receipt she had was valid. Furthermore, the clerk had found that the Santa Fe Land and Development Company had filed similar claims against 3 other properties in the Mesilla Valley over the preceding 18 months, and that 2 of those claims were currently under investigation by the territorial authorities. The clerk recommended that Edna file a formal response to the company's notice and suggested that the matter would likely be dismissed. She read the letter at the breakfast table while the morning light came through the east window in a long, warm bar that lay across the table and across her hands, and Robert watched her read it and watched the tension that had been living in her shoulders for the past month ease itself, by degrees, like a knot that finally releases. When she finished, she set the letter down and looked at him, and for once she did not say anything immediately, and he thought that in her silence he could hear something she had not yet put into words. "It is over," she said finally. "Very nearly," he said. "File the response this week and it will be properly finished." She nodded. And then it was not a dramatic thing, not a sweep of gesture. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment, a brief warm pressure, and then withdrew it as though she had surprised herself. He did not say anything. He let the moment be what it was. She stood and poured more coffee and said in a perfectly steady voice, "The sorrel is ready to saddle, I think. He stood quietly for the blanket yesterday without any trouble." "He did," Robert said. "I thought we might try him under weight today if you want to watch." "I want to ride him," she said. He looked up. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that was both challenge and invitation, the way so many things about Edna Fairchild were both things at once. "All right," he said. She turned, and the morning light was full on her face, and she was looking at him with those dark eyes and something bright and alive in them that had not been there, or had not been visible, in the first weeks of his time on the ranch. "You are going to tell me to take it slowly," she said. "You already know to take it slowly," he said. "You do not need me to tell you," she smiled. It was not the first time she had smiled, but it was the first time she had smiled at him with her whole face in it, and it did something to the landscape of his internal world that was comparable to what the spring rains had done to the pasture. It opened something up, made things that had been dormant suddenly, irresistibly present. "No," she said, "I do not." The sorrow carried her beautifully. June moved into July, and the heat settled over the valley like a vast patient hand, and the work of the ranch deepened into the rhythms of summer early mornings before the worst of the heat, long midday hours in the shade of the barn doing the close work of equipment and harness, afternoons when the light was long and copper-colored back out on the range checking the herd. They fell into a partnership so natural that Robert sometimes found himself thinking about it later with a kind of wondering attention, the way you look at a piece of handiwork that came out better than you expected. She never stepped back from her authority over the ranch, and he never reached for it, and the result was something that looked nothing like the arrangements either of them had seen in the ranches and households of the West. It was two people working on the same project with complementary abilities and the mutual respect of equals. He mended the south fence line. She negotiated the price for the summer cattle sale. He broke 3 new horses for the working string. She kept the accounts with a precision that would have satisfied any bank examiner in the territory. He managed the herd rotation through the summer pastures. She handled every letter from Harding and the county clerk and the Territorial Cattle Association with a clear, competent efficiency that made those parties deal with her directly and without condescension. Eventually, in the evenings they sat on the porch in the long desert dusk and sometimes talked and sometimes did not, and the silence between them had become the kind of silence that is full rather than empty, weighted with comfort and familiarity, and something that neither of them had yet named directly. James Alcott came by in late July to apologize, which Robert thought well of him for. He rode over on a Saturday afternoon and sat on the porch, and said that he was sorry for his brother's involvement with Prout, and that the speculator had since left the valley after the territorial authorities had begun their formal investigation, and that Carl had been persuaded by the family to keep a significant distance from land deals in the future. Edna accepted the apology with directness and without unnecessary warmth. She offered coffee and Alcott accepted it, and they talked for an hour about the water rights and the summer range conditions and the cattle market, and when he left he shook Robert's hand and said, "She is going to be all right, that ranch." "She is," Robert said, and meant it in more ways than Alcott was likely to follow. It was early August when the thing between them shifted into something that could no longer be understood as merely professional, or merely friendly, or merely the comfortable partnership of two people who had built a working trust. They had been riding the eastern boundary of the property, checking the condition of the fence line after a series of summer storms had brought hard rain and wind through the valley. The storms had passed by mid-morning and left the air washed and brilliant, with that particular post-rain clarity that makes the mountains look as though they have been brought several miles closer. The Rio Grande was higher than usual, and the creek that fed from it through the Fairchild land was running with energy, the water cold and fast over the stones. They stopped at the creek to let the horses drink, and Edna had gotten down to check where the bank had eroded slightly at the bend, kneeling in the wet red mud to look at the damage. And when she stood and turned to say something to Robert, she lost her footing on the wet bank and pitched sideways. He was off his horse before he was aware of deciding to move, and he caught her by the arm with one hand and the other arm came around her back, and they were very close suddenly, standing at the edge of the flooded creek with his hands holding her and her hands gripping the front of his shirt, and neither of them moved. The water ran past them with great energy. He was very aware of her hands in his shirt. He was very aware of the breath she drew and the way she did not step back. "I am all right," she said. "I know," he said. He did not let go. She looked up at him, and her face was very close, and what was in her eyes now was not the careful assessment of those first weeks, not the measured directness of a woman taking the measure of a potential employee. It was something unguarded and immediate and vulnerable in a way that he understood cost her something, because she was not a woman who offered vulnerability casually. "Robert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. She had been calling him Sutton for 2 months, in the practical way of the working West, and hearing his name in her voice was like the first genuine note of a song you have heard only in fragments. "Edna," he said. She was quiet. He was quiet. The creek ran. "I am not easy to know," she said, and it was not an apology, it was a fair warning offered honestly, the way she offered all her honest things. "I know it," he said. "I rode 9 days to get here. I have been here 2.5 months. I am not looking for easy." Something crossed her face that he would have called, if he were being precise about it, relief. The profound, specific relief of someone who has been afraid a particular thing is not available to them and has just been told, credibly, that it is. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. What she did was take her hands from his shirt in a deliberate way and put them on either side of his face and stand up on her toes and kiss him. And he kissed her back. And the creek ran past them in the August light, and the mountains stood to the east in their ancient cathedral arrangement, and the horses drank, unconcerned. When they separated, she stepped back and looked at him with those dark eyes, and she was very composed, but there was color high in her cheeks that the sun did not account for, and her expression held something that was the finest thing he had ever seen on a human face. It was Edna Fairchild, proud and unmanageable and deeply private, looking at him with something like hope. "We should look at the bank erosion," she said. "We should," he said. They looked at the bank erosion, and they rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and supper was made and eaten in a state of ordinary domestic peace that was somehow different than every ordinary domestic peace that had come before it, the way the same landscape looks different when the light changes. After supper, he stood on the porch in the warm evening and listened to the night sounds of the valley, and after a while she came out and stood beside him, and they stood together, watching the darkness come up from the east and the stars appear, and she leaned against his shoulder in a way that was so quiet and natural that it was almost like something that had always been happening. "I have been alone here since September," she said after a while, not with complaint, simply with the honest accounting of her situation. "I know it," he said. "I managed," she said. "I know you did. I want you to understand that," she said. "I did not need someone to come and save the ranch. The ranch was going to be all right." He turned to look at her profile against the gathering stars. "I know that too," he said. She turned to meet his eyes, and he could see that she did know he understood, that this was not the preliminary speech of a woman asking for reassurance, but the statement of fact of a woman establishing the terms of something she was considering entering so that there could be no confusion later about what she was and what she was not. "I just did not know," she said slowly, "that it was possible for it to be this way." "What way?" he said softly. "Both of us," she said. "Both things at once." "The ranch managed, and also," she paused, "also not alone." He was quiet for a moment, feeling the full weight of what she was saying and the courage it had cost her to say it. Edna Fairchild, who had been described in every letter as unmanageable, standing on her own porch in the August night and telling him she was glad he was there. "Neither did I," he said, and he meant it completely. He had never been a man who wanted to own something he loved. He had never looked at another person and wanted to contain them, shape them, reduce them to something more suitable. He had grown up watching men do that to women and watching it make both of them smaller, and he had made a private and honest decision somewhere in his younger years that if he was ever fortunate enough to love someone, he would love them the way you love good land, not by trying to tame it but by learning it, earning the right to work alongside it, and letting it be fully what it was. He had not known, when he read those words in the letter and set it down on the table of Mrs. Hatch's boarding house and asked for directions before he finished the page, exactly what he was riding toward. But standing on the porch of the Fairchild Ranch in the warm New Mexico night with Edna's shoulder against his, he thought that some part of him had known it anyway. Some animal compass part that had swung toward her the moment he read the word proud and had not wavered since. He asked her, properly, in September. It was a Sunday evening, and the heat of summer was beginning to ease at the edges. the mornings cooler and the sky a deeper, more serious blue, and the mountains to the east looked the way they always looked in September, which was ancient and very present. They had ridden in the evening rather than the morning, a habit they had developed in August when the sunsets became particularly extravagant, the sky going from orange to rose to deep purple over the course of an hour in a display that seemed to require witnesses. They had stopped on the rise above the eastern pasture where the whole sweep of the valley was visible in the long light, the Rio Grande a silver thread, the ranch house small and solid in its place near the creek, the cattle moving in the lower pasture in the peaceful way cattle move when they are content. He said her name. She looked at him with those eyes. "I have a question," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that either answer is acceptable to me, and that whatever your answer is, I will honor it." She was quiet, waiting. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because the ranch needs a foreman and not to settle anything or satisfy any convention. Because I am in love with you and I want to be your partner for the rest of my life, and I believe, that you might feel something of the same kind toward me. But I understand if you have reasons that make the answer no, and I will respect them." Edna Fairchild looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was doing extraordinary things to the world around them, and the valley was wide and luminous below, and the mountains were the color of old bronze. Then she said, "I have a condition." "Tell me," he said. "The ranch stays mine," she said. "Legally, whatever comes, my name is on the deed. My decisions are final on the land." "Of course," he said, and he meant it without reservation. She looked at him very steadily, searching his face for the usual signs, the subtle flinch, the recalculation, the conditional quality that would indicate he had said of course but meant something smaller. She found none of it, and he knew she found none of it by the way her expression shifted, the last small piece of guard coming down. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the rise above the valley in the September evening and watched the light go and the stars come, and neither of them had anything more to say that the other did not already understand. They were married in November in Las Cruces, at the small white church on the edge of town, in a ceremony witnessed by Beaumont Harding, who wept openly and without apparent embarrassment, and by James Alcott and his wife, who had become something approaching friends in the months since the Prout business had been settled, and by 3 other families from the valley who had come to know Edna over the years, and who held her in the particular kind of esteem that is reserved for people who have demonstrated what they are made of in difficult circumstances. Edna wore her mother's dress, which she had altered herself over the course of 2 October evenings by lamplight, taking it in at the waist and letting down the hem to account for the difference in their heights. It was ivory cotton with small pearl buttons down the back, and with her dark hair pinned up and her dark eyes steady and serious and alive with something warm that only Robert was positioned closely enough to read correctly. She was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in any light. He said so, quietly, standing beside her in the church while the minister cleared his throat and shuffled his papers, and she turned to look at him with those eyes and said, also quietly, "You look very respectable," which from Edna was a considerable compliment. He wore the good jacket he had purchased in Las Cruces the week before, because his own had been left behind in Denver and was not, in any case, equal to the occasion. He had also gotten his hair cut at the barber on Main Street, who had told him without being asked that he was making a fine decision, and that Edna Fairchild was a formidable woman and he ought to be grateful she had agreed. "I am," Robert had said. The ceremony was brief and sincere. When the minister asked if she took Robert Sutton to be her husband, Edna said yes in a voice that was clear and unhesitating and contained, in its certainty, all the things she did not say in the kinds of soft words that other people's ceremonies were full of. It contained her pride and her directness and her hard-won trust, and it contained, underneath all of that, the particular warmth that she only allowed to be visible in certain lights and at certain times, and which Robert Sutton knew better than anyone alive. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon as husband and wife, and the valley was orange and quiet in the November light, and Clara walked with her usual steady patience behind them as they rode. "Well," Edna said, after they had been riding in comfortable silence for a while. "Well," he said. She looked over at him and the corners of her mouth lifted. "We should look at the barn roof this week," she said. "There is a section of shingles on the south side that is going to be a problem by February if we do not address it." "We should," he agreed. "I was thinking about running a second string of cattle through the east pasture in the spring if the grass holds," she said. "Harding thinks the market will be strong." "He does," Robert said. "I read his letter." "I want to expand the garden too," she said. "There is good soil along the south wall that has never been used." He was smiling by now broadly because this was, he understood, Edna Fairchild's love language, the future spoken in practical terms. Plans made for two where there had been plans made for one. The ranch's future conjugated in the plural without ceremony, as though it had always been this way. "We could put in corn along that wall," he said. "The south exposure would give it enough sun." "That was my thought," she said. They rode home. The winter was long and cold that year by New Mexico standards, which meant frost on the mornings, and cold, clear nights with stars so abundant and close that you could stand outside and feel surrounded by them. The house was warm from the stove, and the evenings were quiet and good, and Robert learned things about Edna Fairchild in those winter months that he had not known and could not have guessed from the outside. That she read voraciously, ordering books from the bookseller in Las Cruces, novels and histories, and a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that she had carried since she was 17, and which she read aloud to him on evenings when the stove was warm and the wind was up outside. That she had a gift for drawing, which she exercised in a sketchbook that lived on the shelf by the kitchen window and which contained, he discovered, extraordinarily good portraits of the horses, the landscape, her father in the years before the illness. And he found this last one by accident, and it stopped him, a careful drawing of himself that she must have made from memory, sitting on the corral fence in the evening light, looking out at the range. She saw him looking at it and he thought she would take the book from him, but she did not. She watched him look at the drawing and then she looked out the kitchen window at the winter yard and said, "You have a good face." "Thank you," he said. "It is an honest face," she said. "That is what I meant." "I know it is," he said. She glanced at him, and he could see she was trying not to smile, and then she gave it up and smiled, and he thought for the 1,000th time that her smile was one of the finest things he had ever seen. The way it transformed her face not by making it different but by making more of it available, like a window opened in a room that had been good before and is extraordinary after. By spring she was expecting their first child. She told him in March, sitting at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the east window, with the directness she brought to all factual statements. "I am going to have a child," she said. "I believe it will come in November." He sat down across from her and looked at her face, which was composed and steady, and also, underneath the composure, something he had not seen before, a kind of wondering, the look of a person standing at the edge of a territory they do not fully know, which for Edna was unusual enough that it moved him profoundly. "How are you?" he said. "I am well," she said. "I have been a little unsteady in the mornings. It should pass." "Are you?" He paused, finding the right word. "Are you glad?" She looked at him with those dark eyes, and what was in them was very clear. "Yes," she said. "I am very glad," and then after a pause, "Are you?" "More than I can say," he said. She nodded, and then she put her hands flat on the table and said in her practical way, "I will keep riding through the summer. I will stop when it becomes impractical. The garden will want planting in April." "We will plant it together," he said. "I know," she said. And she looked at him with a warmth that was so full and uncomplicated that it was almost like looking into the sun. You could only hold the direct view for so long before you had to look away, not because it hurt, but because it was too much good to take all at once. The spring was beautiful that year, the kind of spring that follows a hard winter with particular enthusiasm. the pastures coming up green and deep, the creek running high with snowmelt from the mountains, the garden along the south wall of the house filling out with corn and beans, and the kitchen herbs that Edna tended with the same careful precision she gave to everything she cared about. James Alcott came by in April with his wife Louise, who was a warm and capable woman that Edna had come to trust over the months since the Prout trouble. And Louise and Edna walked the garden and discussed the planting, while Robert and James walked the pasture fence line and talked cattle and water. And it was the kind of afternoon that has no drama in it, and is, for that reason, the kind you remember with the most clarity. Louise Alcott, who was expecting her second child herself, looked at Edna with the easy solidarity of shared experience and said, "You are happy." Edna considered this with her usual thoughtful precision. "I am," she said, and her tone carried a mild surprise at the discovery, as though happiness was a country she had traveled to and found, against her expectations, to be a real place with actual geography rather than a destination that existed only on other people's maps. "He is a good man," Louise said. "He is," Edna said, and then she smiled that full open smile and said, "He does not speak over me." Louise laughed, which was a sound that went out across the spring garden and across the yard to where the men were walking the fence line, and Robert looked up at the sound of it without knowing why, and saw Edna laughing too, standing in the garden in the April light with her hands in the pockets of her apron, and something in his chest performed the particular aching movement that it always did when he came upon her happiness unexpectedly. The summer was hot and the work was heavy, but the cattle were in good condition, and the herd had grown with the addition of 12 new head they had purchased in the spring on Harding's recommendation. Edna ran the eastern pasture rotation with the precision of a chess player, and the grass held through August, and the second string of cattle came through in good weight. Harding came out from Las Cruces in September to look at the herd before the fall sale and was openly impressed. 3 years ago this property was one bad season from foreclosure, he said to Robert, while Edna was speaking with one of the cattle buyers Harding had brought along. "She held it," Robert said. "She did," Harding agreed. "And now look at it." Robert looked at it, the clean barn, the tight fence lines, the well-managed pastures, the herd that had doubled in size in 18 months, the house with its south garden in its late-season abundance, and Edna at the corral gate, speaking with the cattle buyer in the direct manner of someone who knows the value of what she is selling and is not in any hurry to discount it. "I did not hold it," Robert said. "We did." "I know the difference," Harding said, with a smile that had something paternal in it, even though he was talking to a man he had met for the first time 8 months ago. "That is why I said what I said." The baby came in the last week of November, which was 1 year and 2 weeks after Robert Sutton had arrived at the Fairchild Ranch with his roan mare and his honest face, and his willingness to be told where things were kept. Louise Alcott came to stay for the confinement, and the doctor came out from Las Cruces, and Robert spent the better part of 8 hours on the porch in the cold November night in a state of barely managed anxiety that he directed into productive channels, by fixing the loose board on the porch rail that had been loose since spring and sharpening every tool in the barn. The baby was a boy. He was named Gerald Robert Sutton, for his grandfather on the one side and his father on the other, and he was born with a remarkable amount of hair for a newborn and with his mother's dark eyes. And when the doctor handed him to Robert for the first time, he was so small and so completely present, and so entirely real that Robert stood in the lamplight of the bedroom doorway, and felt the ground shift beneath him in the way it shifts when the world adds a new dimension that you did not previously know was available. Edna lay in the bed looking at him with those dark eyes, and she was tired in a bone-deep way he had never seen on her before but would not, he already understood, last any longer than she required of it, because that was how she was built. But in the tiredness underneath it was the same thing he had seen in the spring when she told him she was glad, the wonder of the new country, the open-eyed recognition of something vast and real. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and they looked at the baby between them, at Gerald Robert Sutton, 1 hour old, with his dark eyes and his unreasonable quantity of hair and his small, perfect hands. "Looks like your father," Robert said. "He has your ears," she said. "I am sorry for him," she laughed, and the laugh was tired and warm and full. "Your ears are perfectly fine," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight, his wife, Edna Fairchild, who was now Edna Sutton, although she kept Fairchild on the deed and on the ranch sign, and he kept no argument about it. And he thought that the 9 days he had ridden to reach this place had been the most well-spent 9 days of his life. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am better than all right," she said. He believed her. The years that came after were the years of building, which is the best kind of years. The years when things are still becoming what they are going to be, and every season adds something new. Gerald grew into a sturdy dark-eyed boy who was on a horse by the time he was 4 and showed his mother's particular gift for reading the land, the way a born rider reads a horse, instinctively and from the inside. He was followed 2 years later by a brother named Thomas, who had Robert's brown eyes and a personality so cheerful and disarming that it regularly reduced even Edna, who was not a woman given to being disarmed, to helpless affection. The ranch grew steadily through the 1880s. The herd expanded. The pastures were improved with a program of rotation and selective burning that Edna had read about in an agricultural journal and adapted with her usual precision to the specific conditions of the Mesilla Valley. They hired 2 permanent hands brothers named Felix and Domingo Reyes, from a family that had been in the valley for 3 generations, and Edna paid them fairly and treated them with the respect she gave to anyone who worked well and honestly, which in the Fairchild-Sutton household was the only currency that mattered. Felix Reyes had occasion to remark to his brother, in the comfortable shorthand of siblings, that working for Mrs. Sutton was the most demanding employment he had ever had and also the most satisfying, because she never asked more than she would do herself and she never let a day's work go unacknowledged. "She is the one who runs this place," Domingo said. "He knows it," Felix said, with a nod toward Robert, who was in the corral working a new horse. "He does not mind." Felix looked at his brother with mild impatience. "Would you mind," he said, "working alongside someone who ran a place this well?" Domingo considered the ranch in the afternoon light, the strong fence lines, the well-managed herd, the productive garden, the comfortable house, and conceded the point. The water rights issue came back in 1886, not from the Alcott side but from a new claimant, a land company out of Albuquerque that had purchased a parcel to the south and was attempting to divert a portion of the creek flow through a new channel. Edna handled it with the same forensic efficiency she had brought to the Alcott situation 4 years earlier. She located the original territorial water rights documentation, corresponded with the county clerk in Las Cruces, and retained a lawyer named Marcus Webb, who had an excellent reputation in the territory for handling exactly these kinds of claims. The matter was resolved in their favor within 6 months, and the land company withdrew its diversion project. Marcus Webb, who had dealt with Edna entirely by letter through the legal proceedings and who met her in person only when the matter was settled, shook her hand in his office in Las Cruces and said, "Mrs. Sutton, you had the strongest case I have handled in 5 years. You documented everything." "My father taught me to document everything," she said. "He taught you well." "He did," she said. She and Robert rode back to the ranch in the September afternoon, with the same mountains to the east and the same river in the valley below them that had been there since the first evening he had ridden in and found her on the porch. And Gerald and Thomas were waiting at the gate with the particular impatience of boys who have been told supper would be at a certain time, and the riders are late. "You won," Gerald said, with 11-year-old directness. "We did," Edna said, and dismounted with the easy grace of a woman who had been riding since before she could walk. "Did the land company put up a fight?" Thomas asked. He was 9, and the concept of fighting was still glamorous. "They did not fight well," Robert said, lifting Thomas by his arms and swinging him onto his shoulders, which made the boy shriek with delight. They did not document their claims as carefully as your mother documented hers. Always document, Gerald said, in the tone of someone reciting a lesson. Always document, Edna confirmed. They went in to supper. In 1888, Edna's closest friend from her childhood, a woman named Clara Mee Briggs, who had grown up on a farm to the west of Las Cruces, and whom Edna had known since they were both 7 years old, moved back to the valley after 10 years in El Paso, following her husband's death. She came with a daughter of 11 named Rosalind and an almost aggressive cheerfulness that was the precise opposite of Edna's own temperament, and which had somehow always made them the best of company for each other. Clara Mee arrived in a wagon piled with her belongings and her daughter and 3 chickens in a crate that Rosalind had refused to leave behind, and she stepped down from the wagon seat and looked at the ranch and said, "Edna Fairchild, you built yourself a kingdom." "It was already here," Edna said. "It just needed managing." "And him?" Clara Mee said with a frank nod toward Robert, who was helping unload the wagon. "He needed no managing," Edna said. Clara Mee turned and looked at her old friend with the particular sideways look of someone who has known another person long enough to read things that person does not always announce directly. "You are very happy," she said. "I told you in my letters," Edna said. "Letters and faces are different things," Clara Mee said. She linked her arm through Edna's and they walked toward the house in the September afternoon. And behind them, Robert and the boys helped Rosalind carry the chicken crate without being asked, which made Rosalind declare loudly that it was the nicest ranch she had ever visited. And this made Gerald, who was 13, and at the age where opinions of 11-year-old girls were beginning to register in ways he did not fully understand yet, go very slightly red about the ears. Clara Mee settled on a piece of land half a mile down the creek road, in a small house that had belonged to a family who had moved north the previous year. The land needed work, but she had capable hands and considerable determination, and she and Edna fell back into the easy close friendship of their girlhood with the natural speed of 2 people who had never actually stopped being friends, only been separated by geography. Robert liked Clara Mee enormously and recognized in her the same quality he valued in Edna, a complete refusal to be what was convenient rather than what was real. And he and Clara Mee became, over the years, something like the best kind of in-laws, people who understand each other's value to the person they both love and are grateful for it. Thomas, who had Clara Mee's same disarming cheer, became inseparable from Rosalind within a week of her arrival, and they were a constant and companionable pair throughout their childhoods, getting into the manageable variety of trouble that children on working ranches get into, and growing up with the peculiar confidence of children who have been taught that work is dignified and honesty is non-negotiable. The years moved through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, with the particular quality of years that are full of work and seasons, and the accumulation of days that are not individually remarkable, but are, in their accumulation, the substance of a life well lived. There was a 3rd child, a daughter born in 1890, whom they named Frances after Robert's mother, who had died when he was young. Frances arrived with her father's brown eyes, and her mother's absolute certainty about everything, which combination produced a child who was, by age 3, the uncontested authority on the proper conduct of ranch life, and who kept her brothers in a state of respectful compliance that made Robert and Edna exchange looks of quiet amusement over her head on a daily basis. "She is managing us," Thomas said one evening, watching Frances redirect Gerald's attention from a book to a chore she had decided needed doing immediately. "She is," Robert agreed. "She learned it somewhere," Thomas said, with the philosophical acceptance of a boy who has grown up being well managed. "She did," said Robert. In 1893, when Gerald was 12 and Thomas was 10 and Frances was 3, and the ranch had reached the kind of stable, productive equilibrium that is the reward for a decade of careful stewardship. Beaumont Harding retired from his business in Las Cruces and held a dinner at the hotel on Main Street for the ranching families he had worked with over the years. Edna and Robert attended, along with the Alcott family and several others from the valley. Harding, who had grown more sentimental with the years, made a short speech at the end of the dinner in which he said that in 25 years in the cattle business, he had placed a great many men and women on a great many properties and had a mixed record of success, as anyone who worked in that business did. But that there were a handful of arrangements he had made that he was genuinely proud of, and of those, the placement of Robert Sutton at the Fairchild Ranch in the spring of 1882 was the one he pointed to most often when he was trying to explain to younger men what it meant to match a person to a place correctly. Not because she needed him, Harding said, and he looked at Edna directly when he said this, with the honesty of a man who understood the distinction and wanted it on the record. Because they needed each other, which is the best reason for anything. Edna, who was sitting beside Robert with her hand in his on the white tablecloth in the lamplight, accepted this with a nod that said more, in its quiet directness, than a long speech would have. Robert, who was 39 and sitting in a room full of people who were, in one way or another, part of the life he had come to in New Mexico, felt the particular wholeness of a man who had ridden a long road and arrived at the right place. He squeezed Edna's hand, and she squeezed back, and neither of them said anything about it because some things are between two people and are not diminished by remaining there. On the ride home from Las Cruces, with the October night very cold and very bright, the boys dozing against each other in the back of the wagon and Francis asleep in Edna's lap, they rode through the valley in the same direction they had ridden a dozen years ago after the wedding in the November church, and the mountains were the same mountains and the river was the same river, and the stars were the same extravagant, impossible quantity of stars. Harding cried again, Robert said. He always cries, Edna said. He is a sentimental man. I have always liked that about him. I did not know you liked sentimental men. She looked at him sideways in the cold dark and her eyes were bright. I did not, she said, until I discovered they come in more varieties than I had previously encountered. Is that what I am? He said. Sentimental. You rode 9 days to a ranch you had never seen because someone used the word proud in a letter, she said. He thought about that. I suppose I did, he said. Sentimental, she said firmly, and then she leaned against his shoulder in the way she had been leaning against his shoulder for 11 years, her daughter warm and sleeping in her lap and her sons breathing the slow, deep breath of sleeping children behind her, and she said, very quietly, I am glad you did. He wrapped one arm around her and took the reins with the other hand, and they drove through the valley in the October night, and the ranch was ahead of them in the darkness, its lamps out because Felix and Domingo kept the place when they were away, and both of them were practical men who did not leave lamps burning unnecessarily. But the shape of it was there against the starlit sky, the long adobe house, the barn, the corral, the dark garden along the south wall, and it was home in the fullest sense of the word. Which is to say, it was the place where the people you love are, and the place that holds the shape of all the years you have lived in it. Robert Sutton had ridden south from Denver in the spring of 1882 with nothing particular to offer except his experience and his honest face and his willingness to know a good thing when he found it. He had found it. He had known it. He had never, from the first morning he rode the range with Edna Fairchild in the early light, attempted to make her anything other than what she was, and what she was proud and unmanageable and deeply, brilliantly herself, had turned out to be, in the fullest reckoning, the exact shape of his life's good fortune. They put the children to bed when they got home, and then they stood on the porch as they had stood so many times in so many seasons, the valley dark and quiet around them, the mountains present at the edges of the darkness even when they were not visible, and the stars above them as they always were abundant and close and indifferent to everything except the fact of their own burning light. The south fence in the lower pasture wants looking at, Edna said after a while. I saw it, he said. We can ride it in the morning. I want to start the boys on the mending themselves this year, she said. Gerald is old enough and Thomas is close. Good idea, he said. They should know how. Everything they know should be something they can do with their own hands, she said. That is the point. Your father said that, he said. My father was usually right, she said. The night held them in its quiet, and the coyotes sang their distant songs from the eastern hills, and the horses moved in the corral with their small, unhurried sounds, and the house behind them was warm and full of children, and the accumulated years of a life that had been built carefully and honestly and together. She turned and looked at him in the darkness, and he could see her face in the starlight, the face he had known for 11 years and knew still the way you know good music, immediately and with all of yourself. And she was looking at him with the same steady dark eyes that had assessed him from the porch steps on that first April afternoon, except that now they held something that had been building for 11 years and was, in its depth and its warmth and its complete absence of apology, the finest thing he had ever seen. Come inside, she said. He followed her in, and she shut the door on the October night, and the lamp made its small, warm circle in the kitchen, and the house was their house, and the land was their land, and the life was their life built from two people who had both been, in their different ways, alone at the start of it and who had found in each other not the completion of some half-self, but the particular freedom that comes from being fully known and fully kept. Proud and unmanageable, every letter had said. Robert Sutton had read that once and asked for directions. He had never for a single day of the 11 years that followed wished he had kept reading and reconsidered. He had, in fact, every day of those 11 years, been grateful that he was exactly the kind of man who heard that description and reached for a road map instead of a door. In the spring of 1894, when the pastures came up green again, and the creek ran high with the snowmelt, and the garden along the south wall of the house was planted for the 12th consecutive year, and Gerald rode the fence line for the first time alone without supervision, and came back with an accurate and thorough account of every place that needed work. Robert stood at the corral fence in the evening light and watched Edna teaching Frances to halter a horse with the same patient, precise method she had used with the sorrel gelding 12 years ago, her hands guiding the small girl's hands, her voice steady and clear and warm in the way it was warm when she was teaching something she loved too. Someone she loved, and he thought that this was what it looked like, the inside of a good life, not the absence of hard things but the presence of something true, built on honest ground, held up by two people who had agreed to hold it. Frances got the halter on the horse on the third try, and she turned and looked at her mother with the huge, triumphant eyes of a 4-year-old who has just accomplished something she did not entirely believe she could accomplish, and Edna looked back at her daughter with a smile so full and warm that it seemed to light the whole corral, and then she glanced over her daughter's head at Robert, and her eyes were bright and dark, and saying something without words that he heard entirely. He smiled back. The valley held them in its wide and ancient quiet. The mountains stood to the east. The river ran in its silver thread. The ranch was sound. The herd was strong. The children were growing into themselves with the particular confidence of people who have been given real tools and real ground and real love. And the spring evening was warm and the stars were coming, and everything that had been built between a proud woman who would not be managed and a man who had the rare good sense to know that was the finest possible recommendation was here, and solid and real. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world.